HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Traitor by V.S. Alexander, read by Christa Lewis. Prologue. Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938. The night of broken glass. In the dark, the mind can play tricks. That's what I thought when the sounds entered my ears, faint at first, like the play of droplets in a fountain, followed by distant crashes that cracked and splintered the air. I wiped the sleep from my eyes, reached for my glasses, and peered out the window above my desk. The silver clock on my desk read past 1 in the morning. It was November 9th, the 15th anniversary of the failed beer hall putsch, a time of National Socialist memorials and celebrations across Germany for the martyred Nazis. Everyone should have been asleep, but other, equally ominous noises filled the air as well. Muffled laughs and jeers filtered through my window. I opened the latch, hearing the voices spreading across Munich, which seemed to come from every corner of the city, from the very earth itself. Indistinct voices, broken in the air, chanting, "Juden, Juden, Juden," fell upon my ears. I shivered against the shouted barrage of anger and hate. I switched on my desk lamp, and a sickly yellow glow washed over the papers that lay upon my blotter. I'd spent long hours studying before bed. I rubbed my tired eyes, put on my glasses, cupped my hands around my face, and peered through the soot-smudged window of my 4th-story bedroom on Rumfortstrasse. I looked beyond the needle-like spire of the Church of St. Peter, Old Peter, as my mother and father called it, and past the stone buildings that lined the streets, smoke spiraling up in a corkscrew, pummeling the clouds that concealed the full moon. Flames flickered on the horizon as the dark smoke spread across the sky like ink dropped in a bucket of water. Munich was constructed of stone and wood, and the fire brigade would be there soon enough to extinguish the blaze. A feeling I had known few times before settled in my stomach. The sensation reminded me of the time, as a child of 7, I had wandered away from my mother in a department store when we first came to Munich. A peculiar fear filled me. A kind old man dressed in a blue suit that smelled of tobacco and spicy cologne helped me find my mother. The man spoke German with a heavy accent and wore a round cap on his gray head. My mother swept me into her arms and forgot about her anger with me for wandering off. She told me later that if it hadn't been for the Jewish man, someone might have snatched me away. Her voice was flat and calm, nothing like the voices outside my window. This November evening brought that earlier dread back to me, a crushing culmination like brick piled upon brick of the changes that had swept across the city as National Socialism spread at first in small steps, then in insidious leaps and bounds. My Jewish friends, who had once been numerous since the time the old gentleman had been my deliverer years earlier, were now distant, many telling me that I was better off without them. Their words saddened me as they drifted away. I wanted to keep them as friends, even as they preferred not to be seen or heard, sheltering in their homes like secretive, silent mice. In 1938, the Reich pressed its incrimination and repression not only upon my family, but upon every citizen who wasn't a fervent Nazi. Sometimes the tension that vibrated through Munich bordered on paranoia, with a terrible blood-churning excitement that came with a terrible cost. One never knew when the Gestapo might come for your neighbor, or you. As these thoughts raced through my mind, the fire grew larger, the overcast reflecting a hellish mixture of blazing yellow and orange streaked by flowering blooms of black. Then there were more crashes, the sounds of ripping metal and breaking glass, but no alarm sounded. At 16, I was too young to leave my parents' house without permission, but old enough to be curious and frightened by what I saw and heard. I tiptoed down the hall and peered into my parents' bedroom. They slept undisturbed under their blankets, their sleepy breaths rising and falling in rhythm. I crept back to my room, turned off my lamp, and tried to fall asleep while fearing for the city I called home. "Dahlia!" my mother shouted the next morning at my door. I shot up in bed. "Yes?" Mary, my mother, tapped her foot as she always did when I had overslept. "You'll be late for school." She turned in the hall toward the kitchen, her black dress ruffling around her body, her shoes clicking on the wooden floor. My mother always kept her bourgeois attitude, despite the fact that living in Germany was harder than both my parents had anticipated after leaving our Russian home behind. She always looked, no matter the time of day, as if she was going shopping. Another habit that she refused to give up was calling me by the diminutive form of my name. That mannerism irritated me because I was no longer a child. I had turned 16 on the 16th of May. All of my girlfriends, and certainly the boys I knew and liked at school, called me by my full name, Natalya. "There's no school today. It's a national holiday." I yawned and stretched toward the window to see if the fire was still burning. She returned, her eyes flashing in irritation at my sleepy attitude. "Herr Hitler has cancelled the holiday. Herr Hess is speaking tonight, no matter if there's school. If not, you can find yarn for me so I can mend your father's socks." I was at a loss. If the holiday was cancelled, would stores be open or closed? And the task of finding dry goods was becoming almost impossible as the availability of fabrics dried up to support the needs of the expanding Wehrmacht. I washed, dressed, and joined my parents at the breakfast table. "Did you see the fire?" I asked my mother after I sat down. My mother busied herself with the pots on the stove and didn't answer. My father, Peter, lifted a spoonful of porridge to his mouth and gave me a stern look. His eyes narrowed and he said, "Hooligans! Such nonsense!" He took a bite and pointed the spoon at me. "Stay away from them." "How do you know they were hooligans?" I asked. My father's black brows bunched over the bridge of his nose. "Many people are reluctant to talk these days, but some do, even early in the morning when neighbors gather in the hall." "I don't associate with troublemakers," I assured him as I dug into my oatmeal. My father's approach to life, unlike my mother's breezier style, was all business, suitable for a strict disciplinarian. As I grew into my teenage years, I resented the absolute commands that he spewed toward me like platitudes. No and don't were principal words in his vocabulary. After eating, I returned to my room and studied the algebra problem I'd been working on the previous evening. Frustrated by my inability to solve it, I tossed the troublesome paper and pen next to my biology text. The book lay open to its title page, with the spread-winged eagle perched on the encircled swastika. It gleamed up at me as if its black ink had been printed yesterday. We lived with those symbols every day. We had no choice. I cleaned my glasses and wondered if I could sneak out with my friend Lisa Kolbe. She was more knowledgeable about life and worldly interests than I was. I believed she was prettier, more outgoing, with a less melancholy outlook than mine, inherited from her German parents, far different from living in my Russian father's household. Lisa had a way of making friends that I also admired. We'd known each other for years because we were only a few months apart in age and lived in the same building. 2 taps sounded on the floor from the ceiling below. They were soft, but I felt their vibrations through my shoes. Lisa was sending me our long-held signal to meet. I put on my coat and walked to the sitting room. My father was finishing his tea and reading an illegal book, a German translation of the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas. He kept it and a few other illegals concealed behind the bookcase, as if their makeshift hiding place would never be discovered. My father would have refrained from reading a banned book in public, and because our family kept to ourselves, there was little likelihood his cache would be found. I watched him for a moment as his eyes drank in the words. Soon he would put down his reading and go to the apothecary shop where he worked as an assistant to the pharmacist, a job similar to the one he held in Russia before we moved to Munich. My mother gave me Reichsmark for black yarn if I should happen to find a store open. This came after a stern admonition from my father.
Make sure you stick to your business.
I kissed my parents goodbye and stepped into the dusty hall, being careful to tread lightly down the steps. Lisa stood in the half-dark corridor, attired in her tights and jacket, her face partially lit by the single bulb at the top of the stairs. Her blonde hair, verging on silver, was cut in a stylish sweep around her face and ears. The upturned mouth I knew so well offered the usual appearance of a pert smile. "So, where are we headed?" she asked. "Out for yarn." "Exciting," she replied, and feigned a yawn. "I know. My parents have left for work." Her smile shifted to a mischievous grin. "We must see what happened last night." I was as excited as she was about discovering what had gone on, and more than willing to stretch the limits of my father's orders. We sprinted down the remaining steps and out the door. A listless breeze carried the lingering odor of burned wood. "Did you see the fire?" I asked, as we walked through the narrow streets of the city center. To the west, the twin towers of the Frauenkirche loomed near the central square of the Marienplatz. "Only the red in the sky." We were engrossed by the strange timbre of the day. The streets were quiet, but here and there people strode past, eyes cast downward, barely giving us a glance. Sometimes they disappeared up alleyways like phantoms in the shadows. Several young men sat on benches smoking cigarettes or leaned against buildings, looking as if they were fighting off the effects of a long drunken night. They were members of the SA, brown shirts as we called them. One particularly surly fellow with a thick jaw and full head of sandy-colored hair ordered us to stop.
"Juden?"
he asked. We shook our heads and said, "Nein," and after we presented our school papers, which we always carried with us, he let us go. "Can't they tell we're not Jews?" Lisa asked, but I knew she was trying to make a joke. Her words dripped with sarcasm. One of our dear friends, a Jewish girl whom we hadn't seen in several months, was as blonde and blue-eyed as any Aryan could be, yet she was subject to the laws oppressing the Jews. Nothing about these restrictions was fair. Soon we came upon the building that had burned, a synagogue. I had passed by it many times. It was a solid stone building with a large circular window encased in what appeared to be a turret. But the flames had charred everything, leaving the window a round, empty hole like the removed eye of a cyclops. Most of the roof had collapsed upon itself. The stone masonry stood blackened, but some parts had been turned the color of ash by the intense flames. The structure with its burned-out arched windows and doors was as ugly now as the naked trees that stood apart from it. We dared not move too close because members of the SA guarded the buildings, keeping those away who might want to loot it or perhaps save an artifact. 2 women stood behind us, tears streaming down their cheeks as they dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. From their muffled sobs I could tell they didn't want to call attention to themselves. They shuffled away, and a nicely dressed young man strode to my side and took off his hat. He was tall, with hair a mixture of blonde and brown, parted on the left and swept back to the right in the style most men wore. His wide-set eyes were framed by an attractive face, and even with a glance I surmised that he was intelligent and a bit on the cunning side. From his rigid stance to the set jaw, he exuded those qualities.
"The SA set it on fire with gasoline and then tried to throw the rabbi in the flames,"
he said in a low voice while staring at the synagogue.
"He wanted to save the Torah scrolls."
Lisa and I looked at each other, not sure what to say.
"They're dogs, all of them," he continued. "They had the rabbi arrested. He'll end up in Dachau for sure. Pigs."
He turned our way.
"Who are you?"
I started to answer, but Lisa stepped in front of me and said, "It's none of your business. Who are you to ask?" Being the introvert, I fell silent, feeling somewhat sorry for the man who had expressed his sympathy for the rabbi and the tragic arson. Out of kindness, I smiled at him, and his eyes locked upon mine. A jolt of attraction sparked between us for a second, and the hair on my arms prickled with gooseflesh.
"I'm sorry to bother you, but I won't forget you,"
the man said, and tipped his hat. After giving me a look, he disappeared around a street corner behind us. That was strange, I told my friend, while absent-mindedly positioning my glasses on my nose. The electric thrill still lingered on my body. Lisa stood composed, sassy, and stylish a few steps away. I'd never considered myself to be pretty, always judging myself, tall and gangly with perhaps too much black hair. My glasses didn't help my confidence with boys either. "Let's leave before we become more conspicuous," Lisa said, implying that by merely observing the synagogue we had already done so. She was right. One always had to toe the line, to be the good German and not make waves or create a fuss, because any action outside the law could lead to misfortune. As we left, I asked Lisa, "What has become of our Jewish friends? I fear for them now more than ever." And behind that question was a broader, indisputable fact. Lisa and I didn't agree with the Reich's laws and doctrines. There was no exact day we formed that viewpoint, but the propaganda from the state-run newspapers and radio, the men who marched off to war and never came back, the rationing, the building tension in the air, allowed us to reach that conclusion. We silently understood what the consequences were for such thinking, but what could we do about the Nazis? As we walked about Munich, we saw the destruction that was perpetrated for the protection of Jewish property, the looting of goods by the SA and others. Many people emerged to look at the damage, walking like the dead as they passed broken windows, burned storefronts, and looted showrooms. Lisa and I knew that the world was changing for the worse. At the Schwarz restaurant, windows were broken out. Adolf Saalberg fineries on Neuhauser Strasse had been firebombed. The large Saalberg sign was a twisted mass of metal. Heinrich Rothschild's hat and finery store had been vandalized, and words against Jews whitewashed on the windows. The Sigmund Koch music store looted. Display windows smashed at Bernheimer Home Furnishings and Art Store, and perhaps most shocking of all, the large popular department store Uhlefelder on Rosenthal had been looted and vandalized. My father worked for one of the few remaining Jewish business owners in Munich. Lisa and I found him standing on the sidewalk in front of the broken windows of the apothecary, shards of glass like fractured diamonds littering the street.
"What are you doing here?"
my father asked sternly when we approached. His broad jaw, so typical of the men in his Russian family, was clenched.
"Your mother sent you out for yarn, not to roam the streets."
He picked up a broom, propped against the side of the shop, and pointed the handle at us.
"Go home, now! You've seen enough!"
Mr. Bronstein, my father's boss, poked his head out of the shattered window. His pinched face, red eyes, and trembling hands showed the pain incurred by the destruction at his shop. Two brown shirts strolled down the street. My father threw the broom down, grabbed Lisa and I by the shoulders, and whispered to us to stand still.
"Are you a Jew?"
one of the men shouted from down the street. My father shook his head, but stared defiantly at them.
"Go on, then,"
the man ordered, strolling toward us and placing his hand over his holstered pistol.
"Where's Bronstein?"
The owner, small and thin, appeared in the doorway. The man rushed at Mr. Bronstein, shoved him inside the store, and shouted,
"Clean up your mess, dirty Jew! Is this how you run a business? Well, you won't for long. You have to pay for this damage."
A slap and a cry echoed from the shop. My father swiveled us on the sidewalk toward our home, his arms trembling as he guided us. We walked home in silence. As we neared our door, I realized that, overnight, Germany had embraced death over life. The yarn was forgotten. Part 1. The White Rose. Chapter 1. July 1942. If I had believed the world was flat, the steppes would have provided the proof as the earth spread in an unbroken line to a distant horizon. The vast land stretched before me, a patchwork of green grasses that undulated in wind-whipped waves along with the brown stubs of harvested winter wheat, other fields dissected only by the gray bark of infrequent trees or the cubed wooden frames of farmhouses not destroyed in the Wehrmacht's advance. I was on a cramped train, separated from the army men, heading to the Russian front as a volunteer nurse for the German Red Cross. Some of the fields had been burned and only the blackened earth remained, but as surely as the sun rose, the ground had to be tilled and tended by the solitary figures of peasant farmers who stood with pitchforks in hand or sat upon a horse-drawn wagon, if the poor people could force another crop from the ground. Somehow a lucky few had survived. Perhaps the Wehrmacht needed the workers, toiling under slave labor to transport grain back to Germany, or perhaps they had been spared from death by a beneficent Nazi officer. It was the first time I had been in Russia since our family had fled from Leningrad during the first phase of the 5-year plan in 1929. I was 7 years old then. My father had seen firsthand the disappearance of those who didn't meet the work quotas set up by Joseph Stalin. They vanished in the night, never to be seen again, usually sent to their deaths in labor camps. My father had scraped enough money together for us to move to Germany, where he hoped we would have a better life. Because my mother's parents were German, we were granted citizenship before the full rise of National Socialism. But the war was in full bloom after the September 1st, 1939 invasion of Poland, and depending on the train's location, we looked out upon a land that retained its raw beauty or rolled past a landscape blasted by conflict. In Warsaw, I witnessed the desperation of Polish nationals, who had surrendered everything to the Nazis except their humanity. As I slipped a piece of candied sugar to a little girl who offered me a flower, while gazing upon the brick ghetto walls that confined so many Jews. Soldiers herded emaciated people in and out of the gates, marching them in lines toward some unknown destination. I had become numb to the horrors, learning over the years that I could do little to fight against the Reich. In those lands yet untouched by war's deadly grip, the tall birches shimmered in East Prussia. The wide steppes of Russia opened to gently swelling hills. And at those times, with the train windows open, the wheels clacking in rhythmic motion along the tracks, the July heat dissipating with the setting sun, in those times, one could almost forget the cares of war and pretend that all was right with the world. But there were other distractions on the long trip to the front. I traveled with a young woman named Greta, also a volunteer nurse, whom I knew little about other than she had her own plans, as I did, to eventually return to Munich. Because my father worked in a field related to medicine, I was drawn to it, and, furthermore, I had no better idea what to do with my life. I had come to volunteer nursing after my experiences in the League of German Girls. Administering medical care to the ill gave me satisfaction. Changing bandages, helping children who suffered from cuts and scrapes, and learning about the body became my profession in the years following 1939. Although nursing allowed me to get away from my strict father and not immediately give in to the pressure to marry and produce children, as the Reich demanded, one strong disadvantage remained. The German Red Cross became a potent arm of the Nazi regime. We were expected to embrace the Reich's teachings on Aryan supremacy and blindly follow Hitler, both of which I innocently ignored in thinking and action. My father's strictness had inadvertently instilled an anxious tension inside me, which fed my natural shyness. But something stronger bubbled in me as well. An urge to be free, to be my own woman, a nascent rebelliousness. One night, Greta offered me a smoke as I read a biology text in our cramped quarters. The book offered little excitement, but any gathered kernels of knowledge I hoped would help me secure a medical career as a woman under National Socialism. Not being a smoker, I declined her offer. Cigarettes weren't cheap and were often sold on the black market. I wondered where she had gotten them. Good women weren't supposed to smoke, but one of the reasons many became volunteer nurses was for the occasional freedom it offered from such restrictions. Mostly, cigarettes went to soldiers. She held up a bottle of clear liquid. The red label, printed in Polish, read vodka, and when Greta pulled out the stopper, the odor of the sharp, medicinal spirit floated past me. She looked older than her years. The emerging frown lines on her face and the chewed cuticles on her fingers led me to believe that her life had not been happy. Perhaps they were signs of anxiety about the war, or life in general, but she couldn't have been much more than my age of 20. Still, she made herself pretty in a way that was aimed at the men traveling with us. Greta sat in the chair opposite mine, sitting backward to the forward motion of the train as we sped over the vast plain. She lit her cigarette, and a plume of smoke rushed to my face, but dispersed quickly out the open window. I closed my book. "Have you spoken to any of them?" She hitched her right thumb over her shoulder and rested her left elbow on the lip of the window, keeping the lit end of the cigarette near the opening. The spark flared red in the rushing wind. "A few," I replied. "I try not to get too familiar." I had no desire to foster romantic relationships with Army or medical corpsmen. I was headed to the front to do a job, not get a husband, and after all, being somewhat fatalistic, I wondered how long a potential mate would be alive in these dire times. The war on the Eastern Front was dragging on, despite the Reich's claims of victory after victory. To be held by a man, to taste his lips upon mine, would be nice, had such a prospect occurred, but a relationship seemed a matter of secondary importance, considering how men were dying for the Reich. Greta took a drag on her cigarette, took a gulp of vodka, and then held the bottle out to me. I pulled down the shade on our compartment door. "Where did you get this contraband?" "A lady never tells." Greta smiled wryly and tapped her nails on the bottle. "Some of them are very good-looking, including the Russian. Whatever happened to all those lectures about racial purity we had to sit through? Natalya Petrovich, Alexander Schmorell." Her question irked me. I was a native Russian living in Germany. My parents never let me forget that fact. We knew the Reich rumblings about the Untermensch, the subhumans, but non-Jewish Russians living in Germany had mostly been able to live as citizens, particularly those already assimilated. One had little choice in the Reich but to obey. Still, I was proud to be traveling to my homeland on what I considered a mission of mercy. I took the bottle and tipped it back, the strong drink burning my throat, the fire settling in a warm ball in my stomach. "We're all German now. Have a look at my papers. The Reich needs men and nurses." After what had happened to my Jewish friends since the Nazis came to power, I wanted nothing to do with creating a new racial order in the East, a thought repugnant to me. All I was concerned about was saving lives, and if that compassion extended to my fellow Russians, so be it. Of course, I didn't really know what the future held. She shrugged off my rebuff and continued her daydreams about men. "It's hard to choose from among them," she said, her eyes on my mouth as it puckered from another swig of liquor. "Not the best vodka I've ever had," I said, although my experience with drink was limited. "One of them is Russian. He told me so. Alexander. Nice looking." Greta puffed on her cigarette, which had prematurely burned to her fingertips in the train's rushing wake, and then tossed it out the window. "But the one he's traveling with? A real doll." She fanned her fingers in front of her face. I took another gulp of the vodka, and a dull stupor overtook me. I yawned and stretched out in my seat, which served as an uncomfortable bed. "The sun has set. We need to pull down the blackout shades.
Another...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?